Hello, our names are Alex Behal, Mara Hartsing Perna, Tara McRoberts, and Lucas Strezos, and today we'll be presenting on the topics of visual sovereignty and decolonization.
One doesn't have to be a cultural savant to recognize the profound ways in which the media influences culture. W. James Potter frames media effects in two templates: influence on the individuals and influence on large social structures and institutions. Examples of media that is capable of influencing both the individual and the social space are omnipresent in both contemporary and historical culture. And film has proved to be an opportune platform for conveying a social message and inciting cultural change. Some examples of these changes seem inconsequential, such as the film Sideways hurting Merlot sales and boosting Pinot Noir sales in the US.
Do not sabotage me. If you want to be a fucking lightweight, then that's your call, but do not sabotage me.
Oh, aye, Captain, you got it.
And if they want to drink Merlot, we're drinking Merlot.
No, if anybody orders Merlot, I'm leaving. I am not drinking any fucking Merlot!
Okay, relax, Miles. Jesus, no Merlot. Did you bring your Xanax? Right.
Or just as Fight Club began to bloom by the dozen in David Fincher's work in the same name, so too did they in real life.
What do you want me to do? You just want me to hit you?
Come on, do me this one favor.
Why?
Why? I don't know why. I don't know. Never been in a fight. You?
No, but that's a good thing.
No, it is not. How much can you know about yourself? You've never been in a fight. I don't want to die without any scars.
However, other films have proved to incite cultural influences that are much more profound, such as in the 1967 film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Against the backdrop of the racially charged 1960s when race riots were commonplace, the film helped break down the social mores against racial stereotypes and started ever so slowly the acceptance of interracial relationships. This inherent capability of film to influence culture has been recognized as of late by Indigenous storytellers, who have used the medium as a way to revolutionize Indigenous storytelling, and, in turn, presented an opportunity for decolonization. Michelle Rahaja describes this process as visual sovereignty in her book Reservation Realism, Red-Facing Visual Sovereignty and Representation of Native Americans in Film. According to Rahaja, visual sovereignty describes a way of reimagining Native-centered articulations of self-representation and autonomy that engages the powerful ideologies of mass media. Rahaja contends that under visual sovereignty, filmmakers can deploy individuals and community assertions of what sovereignty and self-representation mean, and through new media technologies frame more imaginative renderings of Native American intellectual and cultural paradigms.
Achieving visual sovereignty is a necessary practice, given the pervasive stereotypes about Indigenous culture that have dominated the historical media as a result of a tendency to oversimplify and characterize Indigenous way of life. Venerable stereotypes of Indigenous culture emerged early in the days of European contact and gained widespread acceptance and distribution throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century.
According to Lacey Noel Cotton, the three defining stereotypes of Native Americans are the bloodthirsty savage, the noble savage, and the half-breed. The bloodthirsty savages were generally written as lower than human in both intelligence and appearance, with the cruelty of wild beasts. They were something to be feared, but also conquered. Charles Brockden Brown is often cited as the first American writer to idealize the West in his fiction by writing about Indian savagery. However, examples are omnipresent within the fabric of our shared cultural history, from James Fenimore Cooper's 1820s novel, The Last of the Mohicans, to the 1992 film bearing the same name, and the 1956 Western epic, The Searchers.
According to Cotton, the term noble savage was devised during the primitivism movement in the 18th century and served as a dual purpose for justifying both the low opinion of whites had for Native Americans and the brutal mistreatment of the American Indian during that time period. While the noble savage was morally superior to the white man because of his natural goodness, he was also considered less intelligent and less human, and therefore acceptably expendable by American standards. Dryden originally established the romantic glorification of a savage and more natural lifestyle, ultimately referred to as the noble savage in his 1670s play, The Conquest of Granada, where he stated, "I am as free as nature first made man, ere the base laws of servitude began, when wild in woods the noble savage ran. The noble savage determining features including a harmony with nature coupled with moral innocence and inability to lie. They were marked by their generosity and selflessness while interacting with strangers, as well as possessing a natural wisdom and noticeable moral courage. They were also considered distinctly robust in physical health. Johnny Depp's portrayal of Tonto in The Lone Ranger and The Kicking Bird in Dances with Wolves serve as an example of this character trope. The half-breed Indian was habitually portrayed in two extreme ways. They could represent the combination of what was best in the red and white worlds, resulting in a being that was superior to both races. It is more likely, though, that they are exemplified the worst of two cultures, showcasing the corruption and negative stereotypes of both and making themselves an outsider from all societies. Jenny Calder reminds her audience in There Must Be a Lone Ranger that traditionally the half-breed is the villain, a renegade combining the worst features of both races. He drinks, he's treacherous, frequently he manages to betray both red and white. Other stereotypes include the beautiful maiden who sexualizes native femininity, such as in Disney's Pocahontas and the 1950s Western Technicolor Broken Arrow. Furthermore, there is the vanishing native people, whose antiquated and primitive practice render them incapable of evolving beyond the bounds of traditional hunter-gatherer society. This caricature can be viewed in the Robert Flannery's 1922 documentary, The Nook of the North. Examples of these stereotypes are not isolated to historical film media. Alternatively, they can be found in contemporary media as well, such as Gwen Stefani's controversial portrayal of an Indian princess in No Doubt's 2012 music video for Looking Hot. Native American author Sherman Alexie tweeted that the video No Doubt turned 500 years of colonialism into a silly dance, song, and fashion show.
Now that we have an understanding of the colorful history of Native Americans' on-screen depiction, we can start to determine whether the films we have selected for analysis actually constitute visual sovereignty. Today we will be presenting our analysis in conjunction with existing literature on Smoke Signals, Atunarjuit, and Rhymes for Young Ghouls, to determine if and to what extent these unique pictures utilize visual sovereignty both to dispel common stereotypes about the indigenous people and to preserve and perpetuate indigenous culture through a new form of visual storytelling. We will also consider if and how these films contribute to the process of decolonization by doing so. Finally, we will question if and to what extent film actually presents a practical and effective medium for achieving decolonization and what may undermine its effectiveness in doing so. We were inspired to select this topic after recognizing a common interest amongst our group in Indigenous films and their ability to dismantle these stereotypical representations by emphasizing Indigenous acts of seeing, speaking, and listening. It is important to note that as non-Indigenous students, our analysis does not represent an attempt to appropriate the films we have selected for analysis. Rather, we are working to understand them from a Native point of view.
The first film for analysis is the 1988 picture, Smoke Signals. Drawn from the autobiographical fiction of Sherman Alexie, the film Smoke Signals tells stories of family and community, loss and renewal, memory and survival. It was marketed as the first film to be directed, acted, and produced by Native Americans to have a major distribution deal. The Native filmmakers imbue the movie with distinctive Indigenous perspectives, and as a result, the film is rendered an example of Indigenous activism. In response to historical Westerns and other Hollywood representations of Indians silencing Indigenous people through the tropes such as the vanishing Indian and the stoic Indian characters, Smoke Signals director Chris Eyre and writer Sherman Alexie embedded attempts to dismantle these stereotypes represented in the script. This strategy is visible in the film when Thomas Builds a Fire notes that many First Nation peoples have no history of being warriors, which is designed to reverse the stereotype that all natives are savage warriors. However, Smoke Signal's significance extends beyond its reclamation of media stereotypes. The filmed content models its relationship with its viewers, both counteracting the silencing of Native voices that occurs in Westerns and initiating conversations about colonialism and sovereignty. As Joanne Hearn argues, the opening sequence self-consciously positions the film as an Indigenous intervention that speaks back to the Western representational history. The film's opening focus on the radio station DJ demonstrates the power of media to make Native voices heard. Just as Thomas Builds the Fire's story becomes a part of a shared public memory through the film's voice-over narration. For these reasons, the film constitutes an example of visual sovereignty and contributes to the process of decolonization by both sharing and provoking a narrative that serves to reverse the unjust treatment of Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the film belongs to the fourth cinema category, a term coined by Maori filmmaker Barry Barclay to describe the films by Indigenous minorities working outside of national orthodoxies of colonizing nations. Although the narrative makes explicit references to American Indian relations with the U.S., it in many ways has a transnational application. It references experiences that are contiguous with the patterns of colonialization that exist across Indigenous minority groups in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., and parts of Europe, as well as Asia, just to name a few. As a result of its broad appeal, the film was distributed both regionally and internationally, and, as the first film of its kind, influenced the emergence and visibility of new work by Native filmmakers, which have similarly contributed to the process of forging a unique visual sovereignty as well as contributing to decolonization.
In the wake of the success generated by Smoke Signals, Atinarjuit, the Fast Runner, promised to serve as a kind of Canadian response to Air and Alexi's project. Yet, unlike Smoke Signals, with Rehegias described as relatively simple diegesis, English dialogue, and familiar contemporary references, Atinarjuit features an all-Inuit cast speaking Inuktitut with English subtitles, wearing costumes made of animal skins, and performing ostensibly traditional acts, such as hunting walrus and seal with harpoons and eating raw meat. With its good-natured main protagonists, amateur actors, handheld cameras, team of sled dogs, and long, slow shots of frozen land, appears to share much in common with Flaherty's classic ethnographic documentary, Nanook of the North, and seemingly reinforce Flaherty's contention that Arctic people produce a cinema of the indigenous body and its interaction with the land, but little else. Despite these apparent similarities, the film indeed represents a major departure from indigenous representation in Flaherty's picture, which leads itself to a type of visual sovereignty. Like many indigenous filmmakers, Canuck grew tired of seeing his people continuously misrepresented by filmmakers who lacked the cultural sensitivity to portray them in an authentic manner. Atinarjuit enabled him to tell a culturally cherished Inuit legend in an authentic way that challenges mainstream Hollywood stereotypes. As Michelle Rehegia contends, it compels non-Inuit spectators to think differently, not only about what constitutes indigenous content in films and more conventional representations of Native American and cinematic history, but also about indigenous visual aesthetics. The film's official website states that Atinarjuit's objective was not to impose Southern filmmaking conventions on our unique story, but to let the story shape the filmmaking process in an Inuit way. Furthermore, by honoring the authentic culture in this way, Indigenous communities are, as Michael Lee contends, ensuring the continuity of their language and cultures and representation of their views. By making their own films and videos, they speak for themselves, no longer alien in an industry which a century has used them for its own ends. Atinarjuit approaches what non-Inuit might consider aberrant cultural practices, such as eating raw meat and supernatural powers, with humor and what Rehegia describes as a strategic use of ethnographic film conventions. By doing so, they open up a more subtle, nuanced reading of these practices as a means of entering discourse of sovereignty and rupturing mainstream notions of feminism and Aboriginal representation.
Rhymes for Young Ghouls presents its audience with a fictional narrative detailing Indigenous agency as a response to the oppression of the Canadian residential schools. In the process, Rhymes dramatizes the process of decolonization as presented by anti-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon, as outlined in his chapter On Violence in The Wretched of the Earth. The film's director and writer, Jeff Barnaby, stated that his goal in making the film was to push the envelope with a kind of bare-knuckle cinema. Accordingly, Rhymes for Young Ghouls shocks its audience. Sean Carleton contends that this shock does not simply emanate from the violence within the schools, but with the ability for Indigenous peoples to violently resist and fight back. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon contends that decolonization is always a violent event. In its bare reality, decolonization reeks of red-hot cannonballs and bloody knives. For the last can be first only after a murderous and decisive confrontation between the two protagonists. For Fanon, decolonization occurs as a result of a colonized person's realization that the deployment of violence is critical to achieve freedom from oppression. In Rhymes, Ayla violently kills Popper, an act which creates space for Ayla and others on the Red Crow Reserve to, as Carleton describes, step outside the shadows of colonialism. Consequently, this act may be interpreted as not only a manifestation of Fanon's belief that violence is critical to achieve decolonization, it also emphasizes a type of indigenous agency within the film, whereby the formerly oppressed take charge of their own destiny. The at times graphic and troubling themes and images of this film invite an opportunity for reconciliation and thereby decolonization, according to political theorist Paulette Reagan. In his article on Violence and Vengeance, author Sean Carleton summarizes Reagan's belief, stating, "Canadians must learn to confront the hidden and horrific history of Indian residential schools as a starting point to build greater awareness of and meaningful relations with Indigenous peoples today." He further summarizes her argument, proclaiming that such a strategy of unlearning national myths and narratives that ignore Canadian colonialism or portray it as peaceful or benevolent, which she calls a process of unsettling, can contribute to the larger project of decolonization. With this logic in mind, the use of shock and violence in this film create what Reagan would describe as unsettling potential. Accordingly, it will invite increased awareness amongst audiences about the tragedy that was the residential school system, which will contribute to the larger effort for decolonization. In the following scene, Rhymes' protagonist character, Ayla, forcibly undergoes an unwanted haircut. Her long hair is a symbol of her native culture and heritage, and it being cut by these Catholic figures is blatantly representative of the imposition of Western values on Indigenous youth at residential schools within Canada. The experience is not romanticized in the film. Rather, the stark representation of this authentic phenomenon elicits a similar response within the audience as that which the protagonists experience, one of horror, victimization, and disgust. The scene is one example of the many ways in which Rhymes for Young Ghouls serves as a strong example of visual sovereignty, given that its honest and at times brutal depiction of the authentic Indigenous experience within residential schools invites an opportunity for an appropriate and arguably long overdue apologetic reaction from a country that victimized an innocent people. Moreover, because the film both depicts a process for decolonization in its narrative, and because the film's audience reaction could in fact contribute to a larger effort for decolonization, the film introduces a type of indigenous agency that is contiguous with visual sovereignty.
Film presents an incredibly opportune way to reclaim culture or reverse stereotypes, given the screens are now ubiquitous within our culture. Some might even go as far to claim that screens have not just become ubiquitous within our culture, but they have come to define our culture. Consequently, in a world transfixed by the visual, using such a platform could in fact be an incredibly profound and effective means of capturing attention and eliciting an audience response. However, the ubiquity of screens within our culture and their understanding as a method for transmitting knowledge and ideas means that there is a fight for audience attention. Accordingly, an important question is, will pieces of visual sovereignty, such as Smoke Signals, Atanarjuat, and Rhymes for Young Ghouls, effectively contribute to the effort to decolonization, given the level of saturation within the media landscape, or the amount of content that the film is competing with for audience attention? Thank you for exploring the topics of visual sovereignty and decolonization through film alongside with us. We hope you enjoyed our presentation.